The last argument you lost, you didn't lose because you were wrong. You lost because they were louder. And somewhere in that moment when your voice started shaking, when your chest got tight, when you felt yourself either shutting down or firing back, you handed them the win. Not because your point was weaker, because your delivery collapsed under pressure. Here's what nobody tells you: the person who raises their voice in an argument has already started losing. Because volume isn't power. Volume is panic with sound. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one yelling. It's the one who stays completely calm while everyone else is unraveling. They speak slower when others speed up. They ask questions when others make accusations. They get quieter as things escalate. And that silence, that quiet, controlled, unshakable silence, it makes people doubt themselves. It makes people stop. That is a learnable skill. And in the next 2 hours, you're going to learn exactly how to do it in your marriage, in your workplace, with your family, with anyone who's ever made you feel like your words don't land the way they should. By the time this audiobook ends, you will never walk into a difficult conversation the same way again. Here's what you're going to discover. You're going to learn why most arguments are never about what they're actually about, and how identifying the real issue underneath gives you an immediate, unfair advantage the other person never sees coming. You're going to learn the one sentence that stops any argument cold, not with aggression, not with sarcasm, but with a question so precise it forces the other person to think instead of react. People have used this in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in their living rooms at 11 o'clock at night. It works every time. You're going to learn how to make someone feel heard without agreeing with them. Because here's the truth: most people aren't arguing to win. They're arguing to feel understood. The moment you master this distinction, conflicts that used to last days end in minutes. You're going to learn how to stay emotionally regulated when someone is specifically trying to destabilize you: the coworker who dismisses you in meetings, the partner who brings up the past, the family member who knows exactly which button to push. You'll have a system, not just intentions. You're going to learn how to deliver an uncomfortable truth in a way that makes people lean in instead of shut down, because the problem was never what you said. It was how it landed. You're going to learn how to end an argument so that you both walk away intact, with respect, with clarity, and sometimes even with a stronger relationship than before it started. This isn't about manipulation. This isn't about winning at someone else's expense. This is about becoming the kind of person who never has to fight for their point, because their presence alone makes the point for them. That person exists, and they used to argue just like you do now. Let's begin. Before we go any further, if you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you said the right thing the wrong way, or like you were talked over, dismissed, or worn down until you just gave up, I need you to do one thing right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Mindset Audiobooks. Every week, we release full-length audiobooks exactly like this one, built for people who are done settling for less than they're capable of. No fluff, no filler, real strategies, real psychology, real transformation. This community is growing fast, and the people already here, they're changing how they speak, how they lead, how they live. Chapter 1. The Myth of the Loudest Voice. Why winning has nothing to do with volume. You're in the middle of a conversation that's starting to go sideways. Maybe it's with your spouse, and it's about something that's been building for weeks. Maybe it's with your manager, and it's about something you've been passed over for. Maybe it's with a friend who said something that cut deeper than they realized, and the conversation starts to heat up. Words get sharper, breathing gets shorter, and then someone's voice goes up, and everything changes. Not because a better argument entered the room, because volume did. And here's the thing about volume that no one taught you in school, that no one coached you through growing up, that most people never figure out until they've lost too many fights. They should have won, volume is not authority. Volume is anxiety with an audience. When a person raises their voice in a conflict, they are not demonstrating confidence. They are demonstrating that their nervous system has been activated, that the conversation has moved from a place of thought into a place of threat response. The raised voice is not a power move. It is a tell. It is the emotional equivalent of a poker player pushing all their chips in with a weak hand, hoping the bet itself is enough to make the other person fold. And the tragedy is it often works, because we've been conditioned to associate loudness with authority since childhood. Think about how most of us learned to argue. We watched the adults around us. We watched who won, and what we almost always saw was this: the person who pushed hardest, interrupted most, and made the other person emotionally uncomfortable enough to back down, that's the person who won. The argument ended when someone gave up, not when someone was genuinely persuaded. So we internalized a model of conflict that looks like combat. You stake your position, you defend it, you attack theirs, you hold the line until the other person retreats, or until you do. The problem is, that model doesn't actually produce wins. It produces truces. Temporary, resentment-filled truces where nothing is resolved. And both people walk away feeling worse than before, one feeling like a bully, the other feeling like a victim, and neither one actually changing their mind about anything. Real influence doesn't work that way. Real persuasion never has. Consider what actually happens in the brain during an argument. When someone raises their voice at you, your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for detecting threats, fires immediately. It doesn't evaluate whether the threat is real. It doesn't weigh the logic of what's being said. It simply registers threat, protect. And in that moment, your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thought, nuanced understanding, empathy, and genuine listening, goes offline. Partially, sometimes almost entirely. This is what neuroscientists call amygdala hijack, and it explains something you've probably experienced but never had a name for: why you can be in an argument with someone you love, someone you know is not actually your enemy, and still feel like you do almost anything to either escape or destroy them. The loudness didn't make them more persuasive. It made you less capable of being persuaded, because your brain is now in survival mode, and in survival mode, you are not listening for understanding. You are listening for openings. Now, here's the reversal that changes everything. If raising your voice triggers the other person's threat response and shuts down their capacity for rational thought, then staying calm does the opposite. When you speak slowly, quietly, and with control while someone else escalates, you are not just maintaining your composure. You are neurologically disarming them. You are sending a signal that says there is no threat here. And that signal, that calm, measured, unshakable signal, is the most powerful thing you can bring into any conflict. There's a man named Daniel who works in insurance claims in Atlanta. He has built a reputation at his company over 15 years for being the guy who could handle the most hostile clients without ever losing his cool. He describes one call that stands out. A client had been denied a claim and was convinced the company had cheated him. He called in screaming, threats, profanity, the full storm. Daniel didn't match it. He didn't apologize nervously. He didn't get defensive. He waited until there was a natural pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds, and then he said, in almost the same tone he'd use ordering coffee, "I hear how frustrated you are. Tell me what you were expecting to happen." Not, "Calm down." Not, "Sir, I understand." Not a corporate script. Just tell me what you were expecting. The man on the phone stopped, audibly stopped, and then he explained. And in that explanation, it became clear that he had genuinely misunderstood the terms of his policy. Not because he was stupid, because the policy language was confusing, and no one had walked him through it properly. Daniel didn't win by being right. He won by creating enough calm that the other person could finally hear him. That is the principle at the heart of everything in this audiobook. Most people think winning an argument means being the last one standing, but there's a deeper kind of winning that most people never access, and it has nothing to do with who was louder or who landed the final point. It's the win where both people walk away with more clarity than they came in with, where a relationship doesn't just survive the conflict, it gets stronger because of it, where your point doesn't just get heard, it gets felt and remembered and acted on. That kind of win requires a completely different skill set than the one most of us were handed. It requires the ability to regulate your own emotional state in real time, not after the fact, not in therapy, not in the car ride home when you finally think of what you should have said. In the moment, while it's happening, it requires the ability to listen not for the purpose of responding, but for the purpose of understanding genuinely, understanding what the other person needs to feel before they can hear anything you say. It requires the ability to deliver your truth, your real, honest, sometimes uncomfortable truth, in a way that doesn't activate the other person's defenses before you've even finished the sentence. And it requires knowing when to stop, not from weakness, from strategy. Because the person who knows when to pause, when to wait, when to let silence do the work, that person always has the advantage. Always. Over the next 9 chapters, you're going to build that skill set layer by layer. In Chapter 2, we're going to go underneath the surface of conflict, because almost every argument you've ever had was never about what it seemed to be about on the surface. Understanding the hidden need underneath the anger is the move that changes everything before a single word is spoken. In Chapter 3, we'll talk about language, the specific words and structures that open people up versus the ones that shut them down immediately, no matter how right you are. And by the time we reach the final chapter, you won't just know how to win arguments, you'll understand why the people who argue the least are often the ones with the most influence and how to become one of them. But it starts here, with the foundational truth that the louder voice was never the stronger one. The strongest voice in any room is the one that doesn't need to be raised. Remember that, because by the end of this audiobook, you're going to feel it, not just understand it. And once you feel it, nobody takes it from you. Chapter 2. The argument beneath the argument. What people are really fighting about and how knowing it ends conflicts before they explode. There is a conversation that happens in almost every long-term relationship, romantic, professional, familial, that goes something like this. 2 people are arguing about dishes, or money, or who forgot to make a phone call, or who said what 3 weeks ago at a dinner neither of them particularly enjoyed, and on the surface, it looks like a disagreement about logistics, about facts, about who did or didn't do something specific. But underneath the sharp words and the sighing and the "I never said that" and the "you always do this," there is something else happening entirely, something neither person has named out loud, something in many cases neither person has even consciously identified in themselves. One person isn't actually angry about the dishes. They're angry because they feel invisible, because they've been carrying more than their share for months and nobody has noticed, and the dishes are just the moment the weight finally became too heavy to pretend wasn't there. The other person isn't actually defending the dishes. They're defending themselves against the feeling of never being enough, against the quiet, persistent fear that no matter how much they do, it won't satisfy the standard being held over them. 2 people, 1 argument about dishes, 2 completely different emotional crises happening simultaneously, and neither one of them talking about either one. This is the argument beneath the argument, and it is the source of almost every conflict you have ever had. Here is something that will reframe everything you thought you understood about human disagreement. People do not argue primarily to be right. That is almost never the real goal, even when it looks like it is. People argue because something in them feels threatened. Their sense of fairness, their sense of worth, their need to be understood, their fear of being abandoned, dismissed, controlled, or disrespected. The argument is the symptom. The threat is the disease. And this matters enormously, because if you spend all your energy addressing the symptom while the disease goes untouched, the conflict doesn't end. It pauses. It goes underground. It stores itself up and comes back louder the next time over something equally mundane, with twice the emotional weight, because now it's carrying last time's unresolved charge along with it. You've seen this pattern. You've probably lived it. The argument that shouldn't have been a big deal but somehow became enormous. The conversation that started about something small and ended with someone bringing up something from 2 years ago. That's not irrationality. That's accumulation. That's what happens when the real issue never gets addressed, because everyone stayed on the surface, fighting the visible battle while the invisible one kept growing. The psychologist Abraham Maslow spent his career studying what drives human behavior, and what he found, at the foundation of everything, was a hierarchy of needs. But long before we get to self-actualization, long before people are thinking about purpose or growth or meaning, there are more primal needs that, when unmet, take over everything else. The need to feel safe, the need to feel seen, the need to feel valued, the need to feel like we have some control over our own lives. When any of those needs get threatened even subtly, even unintentionally, the brain responds as if the threat is physical. Your body doesn't distinguish between a lion in the grass and a partner who said something dismissive at the dinner table. The emotional circuitry is the same. The urgency is the same. And the conversation stops being about the issue at hand and starts being about survival. This is not weakness. This is not immaturity. This is human neurology operating exactly as it was designed to. And the person who understands this has a profound advantage in every conflict they enter, because they are not confused by surface behavior. They are reading the signal underneath it. So what's this look like in practice? Imagine you're in a meeting at work. You present an idea. Your colleague, someone you've had friction with before, pushes back immediately, hard, in front of everyone. Their tone is dismissive, maybe even mocking, and your first instinct is to defend your idea, to fire back with data, to prove in front of the room that you are right and they are wrong. That is the surface argument, and you might win it. You might have better data. You might be objectively correct. But here's what you'd be missing. Why did they push back that hard, that fast, that publicly? Maybe they feel threatened by you, by your competence, by the fact that leadership has been paying more attention to your contributions lately. Maybe they are carrying a fear of irrelevance that has nothing to do with your idea and everything to do with their own quiet terror that they're being left behind. Maybe the last time someone presented an idea like yours, it made their project look redundant, and they've been waiting for this moment. None of that is visible on the surface. All of it is driving their behavior. The person who can read that, who can respond not just to the argument being made, but to the need underneath it, is the person who walks out of that meeting having handled something the rest of the room didn't even know was happening. There is a technique that therapists, negotiators, and some of the most effective leaders in the world use, and almost nobody uses it in everyday conflict, because it requires something that feels counterintuitive in the heat of an argument. It requires you to slow down and get curious instead of defensive. It's called identifying the underlying need, and the entry point is deceptively simple. When a conversation starts to escalate, instead of preparing your rebuttal, you ask yourself one quiet internal question. What does this person need to feel right now that they're not feeling? Not what do they want to be right about. Not what are they trying to take from me. What do they need to feel? Are they feeling dismissed? Then they need to feel heard, and until they feel heard, they cannot hear you. Are they feeling disrespected? Then they need acknowledgement of their value before logic will reach them. Are they feeling scared about something they haven't named yet? Then the argument will never end on the surface, because the fear underneath it hasn't been touched. Once you identify the need even approximately, your entire approach shifts. You stop trying to win the stated argument and start addressing the actual one. And the moment you do that, something remarkable happens. The temperature drops. The person across from you feels something shift. Even if they can't name what it is, they feel sometimes for the first time in that conversation like they're being met rather than countered. And that feeling is the beginning of resolution. Let's make this real with a scenario most people in America know intimately. Marcus and his father have argued about money for years. Every holiday, every phone call that runs too long, it surfaces his father's disapproval of how Marcus manages his finances, the jabs about stability, the comparisons to cousins who chose safer careers. Marcus has defended himself with facts every time. He earns well. His bills are paid. His choices are deliberate. And still, every conversation ends the same way, with both of them more dug in than before, the distance between them a little wider. What Marcus eventually came to understand through a lot of painful reflection and one very honest conversation with his wife was that his father wasn't arguing about money at all. His father had grown up with nothing, real nothing, the kind that leaves marks on a person that never fully heal. For his father, financial instability wasn't an abstract concern. It was a memory. It was old, unprocessed fear dressed up in present-tense criticism. The day Marcus stopped defending his balance sheet and said, "Dad, I think you spent a lot of years scared about money, and I think you're scared for me," everything changed. His father went quiet in a way he never had before. Not the defensive quiet, the real kind. The kind that comes right before something honest surfaces. That conversation didn't fix everything overnight, but it ended a decade-long argument in about 40 seconds, because Marcus finally addressed the argument beneath the argument. Here's the skill you are building in this chapter, and it is one of the most powerful tools you will carry into every difficult conversation for the rest of your life. Before you respond to what someone is saying, pause long enough to ask what they are feeling. Before you defend your position, identify what need is driving theirs. Before you bring out your evidence, determine whether evidence is even what this moment requires, or whether this moment requires something entirely different. Most arguments cannot be won with logic because they were never started with logic. They were started with pain, or fear, or a need for recognition that nobody addressed early enough. And the person who recognizes that first, who can set aside the ego investment of being right long enough to ask what's actually happening, that person holds more power in that conversation than any volume or any data could ever provide. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about language, the specific words that open people up versus the ones that close them down immediately, no matter how valid your point is. Because now that you know what the real argument is about, it's time to learn how to speak directly to it. The right words at the right moment don't just win arguments, they make the argument disappear entirely. Chapter 3. The words that win and the words that wound. How your language is either opening doors or slamming them shut before you finish your sentence. You have been in a conversation where someone said exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, and you felt it physically. Something in your chest loosened. Your shoulders dropped half an inch. Your guard, which had been up and locked, quietly came down, and suddenly, you were willing to listen in a way you weren't 10 seconds before. You have also been in the opposite conversation, where someone opened their mouth, and within the first sentence, sometimes within the first 3 words, every door inside you slammed shut simultaneously. Not because their point was wrong, not because the facts weren't on their side, but because of how it landed. The tone, the phrasing, the specific words chosen, and from that moment forward, it didn't matter how logical or reasonable the rest of their argument was. You were done. You were defending. You were somewhere else entirely. This is not a character flaw. This is not you being too sensitive or too reactive. This is your brain doing exactly what it was built to do, scanning every incoming signal for safety or threat, and responding accordingly before your conscious mind has even processed the full sentence. And here's the implication that most people completely miss: the words you choose in a conflict are not just communication tools, they are neurological triggers, and every single one of them is either pulling the other person toward you or pushing them away, whether you intend it or not. Let's start with the most destructive word in the English language when it comes to conflict resolution. Not a curse word, not an insult. A word so common, so casually used, that most people deploy it dozens of times a day without registering the damage it does every single time. The word is but. Watch what happens when you insert it into an otherwise reasonable sentence. I understand where you're coming from, but you're missing the point. Read that again. Notice what the word but does. It functions as an eraser. Everything before it disappears. Every acknowledgement, every gesture toward understanding, every attempt at empathy gets completely canceled by what follows. The person hearing that sentence doesn't walk away feeling understood. They walk away feeling set up. Like the first half of your sentence was a polite formality before you got to what you actually wanted to say. Now replace the but with and. Same sentence, different architecture. I understand where you're coming from, and I want to share a different angle on it. Read that. Feel the difference. The and doesn't erase the first half, it builds on it. It signals that both things can be true simultaneously, that you're not canceling their perspective, you're adding to it, that there's room in this conversation for more than one reality. One word, completely different emotional experience, completely different outcome. The second category of language that destroys more arguments than any raised voice ever could is what researchers call absolute language. And if you pay attention to your own speech patterns in conflict, you will find it everywhere. You always do this. You never listen to me. Every single time, this is what happens. These phrases feel powerful in the moment. They feel like you're finally making the full weight of your frustration known. But what they actually do neurologically, emotionally, relationally, is catastrophic to productive conversation. Because the moment you use the word always or never, you have handed the other person an escape hatch. Now, instead of addressing the genuine issue you've raised, they can spend the entire rest of the conversation finding the one exception that proves you're absolute wrong. That's not true. I listened last Tuesday. And suddenly the argument has shifted. You're no longer talking about the real problem. You're litigating your word choice. You're defending a claim that was never the point, and the actual issue, the one that matters, the one that needed to be addressed, is buried under a semantic debate that serves nobody. Specificity is not weakness. Specificity is precision. When this happens, I feel like my perspective doesn't matter, is infinitely more powerful than you never care about what I think, because it cannot be argued away. It is your experience. It is specific. It is true. And it forces the conversation to stay on the real issue instead of escaping into Now let's talk about the language structure that changes more conversations than almost any other technique in this entire audiobook. It is called the I statement. And before you dismiss it as something you heard in a middle school health class, understand that the reason it has been taught for 50 years in therapy rooms, negotiation trainings, and conflict resolution programs around the world is because it works with extraordinary consistency when used correctly. Most people argue in you statements. You made me feel disrespected. You weren't listening. You always make this about yourself. Every you statement, no matter how legitimate the grievance behind it, functions as an accusation. And when a person feels accused, their brain's first and most immediate response is to defend, not to understand, not to empathize, to defend, which means the conversation immediately becomes adversarial, two people trying to protect themselves rather than two people trying to solve something. Shift it to I. I felt disrespected when that happened. I feel like I'm not being heard right now. I feel like I'm being pushed to the side in this conversation. Notice the dramatic change in dynamic. The I statement is not an accusation. It is a disclosure. You are not attacking the other person's character. You are revealing your own experience, and it is nearly impossible to argue with someone's stated experience because they are the only authority on it. You have completely removed the defensive reflex. Now there is nothing to fight against, only something to understand. There is a woman named Patricia who manages a team of 11 people at a logistics company in Chicago. For the first 4 years of her management career, she described herself as someone who struggled enormously with difficult conversations, the kind where performance wasn't where it needed to be, or where two team members were in open conflict, or where she needed to deliver feedback that someone genuinely didn't want to hear. Her instinct, like most people's, was to soften the blows so much that the actual message got lost, or alternatively, to finally reach her limit and deliver the feedback so bluntly that the person shut down entirely and walked away feeling attacked rather than coached. The shift came when she stopped framing feedback as a judgment and started framing it as an observation connected to a specific outcome. Instead of "your communication style is creating problems on this team," which is a verdict, she learned to say, "I've noticed that when updates aren't shared early, the rest of the team loses time they can't recover. Help me understand what's getting in the way." Same issue, completely different entry point. The first version positions her as judge. The second version positions both of them as people looking at a shared problem together. And the second version consistently, repeatedly produced actual change. Not compliance from fear. Real, lasting behavioral change, because the person she was speaking to never felt cornered. They felt included in the solution. That distinction between cornering someone and including them is everything. There are two more words that deserve specific attention because they are uniquely powerful in escalating conflicts, and most people use them constantly without realizing the damage being done. The first is calm down. No two words in the English language have a more reliably opposite effect than the two they're meant to produce. Telling someone to calm down when they are emotionally activated does not calm them down. It tells them that their emotional response is a problem, that they are the problem, and it escalates the very state you were hoping to de-escalate. If you need someone to regulate, the language that actually works sounds like this: "Take all the time you need," or "I'm not going anywhere, I want to hear everything you have to say." Those phrases send safety signals. Calm down sends a dismissal signal dressed as a request. The second is, "You're wrong." Not because people are never wrong, they frequently are, but because the phrase itself activates ego defense so powerfully that being right becomes almost irrelevant. If your goal is to actually change someone's mind, telling them they are wrong is often the least effective path to that outcome. More effective language sounds like, "Help me understand how you got there," or "That's interesting. I've been seeing it differently, and I'd love to compare notes." You are not abandoning your position. You are choosing an entry point that keeps the other person's mind open instead of slamming it shut the moment you start speaking. Here is the principle that ties everything in this chapter together, and it is one worth writing down somewhere. You will see it again. In any conflict, your first job is not to make your point. Your first job is to keep the other person's mind open long enough for your point to actually reach them. Because a perfect argument delivered to a closed mind accomplishes nothing. But even an imperfect argument delivered with the right language to someone whose defenses are down and whose trust is present, that argument lands. It sticks. It changes something. Words are not just how you express what you think. In conflict, words are the architecture of outcome. Build carefully. In Chapter 4, we are going to go even deeper into the most underestimated weapon in any difficult conversation. Something so simple that most people never think to use it deliberately. Something that communicates more authority, more confidence, and more emotional intelligence than any clever sentence you could ever construct. The power of silence and exactly how to use it. Chapter 4. The loudest thing you'll never say. How silence becomes your most powerful weapon in any conflict. There is a negotiation tactic taught inside the FBI's behavioral training program used by hostage negotiators, federal investigators, and some of the most high-stakes deal-makers in the world that costs nothing, requires no preparation, and can shift the entire power dynamic of a conversation in under 5 seconds. It is not a clever phrase. It is not a psychological trick. It is not a reframe or a redirect, or a carefully constructed question designed to make the other person feel heard. It is the deliberate decision to say absolutely nothing. To sit in the silence, to let it exist, to resist every impulse your nervous system fires at you to fill it, fix it, explain yourself, or soften the moment with words that dilute your position, to simply stop speaking and wait. Most people are so deeply uncomfortable with silence in conflict that they will do almost anything to end it. They will backtrack on a point they just made. They will over-explain something that didn't need explanation. They will apologize for something they weren't actually wrong about. They will talk themselves out of a winning position simply because the silence felt unbearable and filling it felt like relief. And every single time they do that, every time they reach for words to escape the discomfort of quiet, they hand over something they didn't need to give. In a conflict, the person who is most comfortable with silence holds the most power, every single time. To understand why silence works the way it does, you need to understand something about how the human brain processes discomfort during conflict. When two people are in a tense conversation, and one of them stops speaking, really stops, not just pausing to breathe, but genuinely going quiet with full presence and no apparent urgency to continue, the other person's brain immediately begins working, and not in a neutral way, in a searching, self-examining, self-questioning way. Because silence in human communication is not empty. It is loaded. It carries weight and expectation and pressure that words sometimes can't manufacture on their own. When you go quiet after making a point, the other person doesn't experience your silence as nothing. They experience it as something, as a space that needs to be filled, as a question that needs to be answered, as a response that needs to be justified. And in that pressure, people reveal things. They elaborate when they meant to stay brief. They soften positions they came in ready to hold at all costs. They fill the silence with honesty they hadn't planned on offering, because the silence demanded something, and their discomfort with it handed that something over before their better judgment could intervene. Chris Voss, the former FBI lead hostage negotiator and author who spent decades in the most high-pressure conversations imaginable, has spoken extensively about this phenomenon. In his experience, silence after a well-placed question or statement consistently produced more information, more concession, and more genuine movement toward resolution than any follow-up argument ever could. The silence did the work that words couldn't. Think about the last time someone said something to you that genuinely landed. Something that made you stop and actually reconsider. Something that shifted your perspective even a little. Chances are, it wasn't a rapid-fire sequence of points delivered with increasing urgency. Chances are, it was one thing, one observation, one question, one honest statement followed by space, followed by quiet, followed by enough room for the idea to actually settle into your thinking before the next thing came in and displaced it. This is not accidental. This is how the mind processes meaning. We need space between ideas the same way we need space between words. Without it, everything runs together, and nothing registers with the depth it deserves. When you speak continuously in a conflict, when you stack point on top of point on top of point in an attempt to overwhelm the other person with the sheer volume of your correctness, you are not increasing your persuasive power. You are diluting it. You are giving the other person's brain so much to push back against that they never have to fully sit with any single thing you've said. But when you make one clean, precise point and then go quiet, you have forced their attention onto that one thing. There is nowhere else for their mind to go. The silence holds them there. And sometimes, in that silence, something shifts without you having to say another word. There is a specific technique built directly on this principle that skilled communicators use in high-stakes conversations, and once you learn to recognize it, you will see it everywhere. It is called the strategic pause, and it works in 3 distinct situations that come up in almost every difficult conversation. The first situation is immediately after you have made your most important point. Instead of following it with more context, more evidence, more elaboration, you stop. You let the point stand alone in the room. You make eye contact, and you wait. The discomfort of that silence will be real, especially at first. But the message that silence sends is this: I said what I meant what I said, and I have nothing to add because nothing needs to be added. That is confidence in its purest form, and it is far more persuasive than anything that could follow. The second situation is when the other person says something provocative, something designed to destabilize you, something intended to make you react emotionally and lose your footing. Instead of reacting, instead of defending, attacking, or explaining, you pause. For 3 seconds, for 5 if you need them. In those seconds, your nervous system has a chance to catch up with the moment. Your prefrontal cortex comes back online, and when you do respond, you respond from a place of choice rather than reaction. The other person loses the thing they were banking on, your emotional response, and suddenly, they are the one who is off balance. The third situation is when you genuinely don't know what to say yet. Most people in conflict treat not knowing what to say as a crisis that must be resolved immediately by saying something, anything to fill the void. But there is enormous strength in simply saying, "Give me a moment to think about that," and then actually taking it. What you are communicating with that pause is not weakness or confusion. You are communicating that you take the conversation seriously enough to respond thoughtfully rather than reflexively. That is a form of respect, and people feel it, even when they can't name it. There is a story about a courtroom in Atlanta in the late 90s that gets shared among trial attorneys as an example of silence used with devastating precision. A defense attorney was cross-examining a witness whose testimony was pivotal to the prosecution's case. The witness was confident, well-prepared, answering every question cleanly and without hesitation. The attorney asked one final question, a simple, quiet question about a specific detail in the witness's account. The witness answered. The attorney said nothing, wrote something down on a notepad, looked back at the witness, still said nothing. The silence stretched for what courtroom observers described as a full 10 seconds, which, in that setting, feels closer to 10 minutes. The witness, unable to bear it, started elaborating, adding details, qualifying the answer they had just given. And in that elaboration, in that discomfort-driven rush to fill the silence, they contradicted a detail from their earlier testimony. The attorney hadn't trapped them with a clever argument. The attorney had simply stopped talking and let the silence do the work. The witness had done the rest themselves. Now here's the dimension of silence that most people never consider, because most people think of silence purely as a reactive tool, something you use after someone else has spoken. But silence can be proactive. It can be the thing you bring into a conversation intentionally, before a single difficult word has been exchanged. When you enter a tense conversation already calm, already unhurried, already carrying the quiet of someone who has nothing to prove, you change the room before you open your mouth. Your stillness communicates something the other person's nervous system picks up immediately. This person is not afraid of this moment, and that signal alone, the signal of calm readiness, of unforced quiet, restructures the power dynamic in ways that talking never could. This is why the most effective leaders, negotiators, and communicators in the world are almost universally described by the people around them as unhurried, not slow-witted, not passive, unhurried. There is a tremendous difference. The unhurried person isn't absent from the moment. They are more present in it than anyone else in the room. They are simply not being driven by urgency, and that absence of urgency reads to everyone around them as authority. You can practice this deliberately. Before your next difficult conversation, give yourself 60 seconds of real quiet beforehand. Not scrolling, not rehearsing your opening line, just stillness. Let your nervous system settle. Walk in already arrived, already calm, already holding the silence inside you, rather than looking for it outside. The conversation will feel different from the very first moment. Here is what this chapter ultimately comes down to: the single principle worth carrying into every conflict you will ever navigate from this point forward. You do not have to fill every moment to own it. The instinct to keep talking, to keep explaining, to keep justifying, that instinct is driven by anxiety, not strength. Real strength is the ability to say the thing that needs to be said, and then trust it enough to let it stand in the quiet. Because silence used deliberately doesn't signal that you have run out of things to say. It signals something far more powerful than that. It signals that you have already said enough. In Chapter 5, the deepest chapter in this entire audiobook, we are going to talk about something that almost nobody discusses in the context of conflict, but that changes every difficult conversation the moment you understand it. We are going to talk about emotional regulation, not as a concept, but as a real-time practice. How to stay completely steady inside yourself when everything outside is pushing you toward the edge. What you learn in the next chapter will change not just how you argue, it will change who you are when the pressure is on. Chapter 5. The Fire Inside the Fight. How to stay completely steady when everything around you is designed to make you break. There is a version of you that you have met before. Not the version that shows up on good days when you are rested, when the pressure is manageable, when the people around you are reasonable and the stakes feel low. Not that version. The other one. The one that appears specifically when the conversation gets hard. When someone says the thing that hits the exact nerve they know how to find. When the tone shifts and the words get sharper and something inside you, something primal and fast and entirely beyond your conscious control, ignites. You know this version. You've watched it take over a conversation you were handling well. You've felt it close your throat and tighten your chest and send blood rushing to your face at the precise moment you needed to be clear-headed. You've seen it say things you immediately regretted, or go so silent and cold that the damage was just as real. You've experienced the aftermath, the drive home replaying what happened, the 3 a.m. reconstruction of everything you should have said differently, the quiet erosion of something that mattered because you couldn't hold your ground when the heat came. That version of you isn't the enemy. That version of you is simply unmanaged, and unmanaged does not mean unmanageable. Emotional regulation, real, practiced, in the moment. Emotional regulation is the single most decisive skill in any conflict. Not the cleverest argument, not the most precise language, not even the best understanding of the other person's hidden needs. The ability to stay steady when everything is pushing you toward the edge, that is what separates the people who consistently win difficult conversations from everyone else. This is the chapter where you learn how to become that person. Before we talk about how to regulate, you need to understand what you are actually regulating, because most people have a dangerously incomplete picture of what happens inside their own bodies during conflict. And that incomplete picture is exactly why their attempts at staying calm so often fail. When you enter a tense conversation, or when a conversation that started neutrally shifts into something threatening your body, initiates what physiologists call the stress response. Your amygdala, which you heard about in Chapter 1, fires a signal so fast that it bypasses your conscious awareness entirely. Before you have processed what was said, before you have decided how to feel about it, before your rational mind has formed a single coherent thought, your body is already responding. Cortisol and adrenaline flood your system within seconds. Your heart rate accelerates. Your breathing becomes shallower and faster. Blood moves away from your digestive system and your prefrontal cortex, the reasoning, empathizing, strategic thinking part of your brain, and redirects toward your muscles, preparing you for physical action that this conversation almost certainly does not require. Your vision narrows. Your hearing sharpens in some ways and distorts in others. Your working memory shrinks, and your capacity for nuanced, creative, emotionally intelligent thinking, the exact capacity you need most in a difficult conversation, is dramatically reduced. This is not a character flaw. This is 4 million years of evolution protecting you from predators that no longer exist. But the system doesn't know that. The system simply responds to perceived threat and a raised voice, a dismissive tone, a direct challenge to your sense of worth. These register as threat with the same urgency as physical danger. Understanding this changes everything, because you cannot think your way out of a physiological state. You cannot simply decide to be calm while your body is running a full threat response. The regulation has to happen at the level of the body first, and then the mind follows. There is a technique used by Navy SEALs, emergency room physicians, and elite athletes operating under extreme pressure that neuroscientists have validated as one of the fastest and most reliable ways to interrupt the stress response in real time. It is called tactical breathing, and it is so simple that most people dismiss it the first time they hear it. They shouldn't. The mechanics are straightforward. You inhale for 4 counts, you hold for 4 counts, you exhale for 4 counts, you hold again for 4 counts. One full cycle takes approximately 16 seconds. In those 16 seconds, something measurable happens inside your body. Your heart rate begins to slow. Your prefrontal cortex begins to come back online, and the physiological grip of the stress response starts to loosen. You do not need to leave the room to do this. You do not need to announce it. You can be sitting across from someone in the middle of a heated conversation and run 1 or 2 quiet cycles of this breathing without them noticing anything except that you seem inexplicably composed. That composure is not performance. It is physiology. You have given your nervous system a manual override, and in doing so, you have reclaimed access to the version of yourself that can actually navigate what is happening. But breathing is only one layer, because emotional regulation in conflict isn't just about managing the initial spike. It is about what happens over the sustained duration of a difficult conversation, the slow accumulation of pressure, the repeated provocations, the moment somewhere in the middle where the other person says something so precisely targeted that the breathing alone isn't enough. For those moments, you need what psychologists call a cognitive anchor, a thought, a phrase, a remembered truth that you return to deliberately when the current moment threatens to sweep you under. For some people, the anchor is a question: what outcome do I actually want from this conversation? Because in the heat of conflict, the brain forgets the goal. It stops working toward resolution and starts working toward retaliation, toward being right, toward making the other person feel what you are feeling, toward winning the moment at the cost of the relationship. The anchor question pulls you back to purpose. It reminds you why you are in this conversation at all and what you are willing to sacrifice to win a point that will not matter in 6 months. For other people, the anchor is a simple internal reminder. Their behavior is about their state, not my worth. Because one of the most destabilizing things that happens in conflict is the instinct to take everything personally, to interpret someone's anger as a verdict on your value, their dismissal as proof of your inadequacy, their aggression as confirmation of something you already feared about yourself. The anchor dissolves that interpretation before it can take root. Their behavior is information about their emotional state. It is not a referendum on who you are. There is a man named Raymond who runs a small construction business in Dallas with 14 employees and a partner he has worked alongside for 11 years. By his own description, Raymond spent the first 8 years of that partnership losing arguments he should have won, not because he was wrong, but because he could not stay regulated when his partner pushed back hard. His partner had a particular style in conflict: loud, fast, absolute, and personal. When things got tense, he came in with both barrels, and Raymond, every time, felt something inside him respond in kind. His voice would rise. His language would get imprecise. He would make the conversation about the history of every previous disagreement instead of the issue in front of them, and they would end up exactly where they always ended up. Two stubborn, exhausted men who had burned through hours of emotional energy and resolved absolutely nothing. The shift came when Raymond made one specific decision before a conversation he knew was going to be difficult. He decided, in advance, that no matter what his partner said in the first 5 minutes, he was not going to respond to it immediately. He was going to listen completely. He was going to breathe. He was going to let the first wave of whatever came at him pass through without latching onto it. His partner came in hard, as expected. Raymond sat with it, breathed through it, nodded, and when his partner finally finished the opening volley and looked across the table waiting for the counterattack, Raymond said, quietly, and without any sharpness at all, "Tell me more about what's driving this for you." His partner, who had been fully braced for impact, visibly deflated, not in defeat, in relief, because what Raymond had just offered him was something he had not expected in 11 years of partnership. He had offered genuine space, and in that space, something honest finally surfaced that both of them had needed to hear for years. The conversation that followed was the most productive they had ever had, not because Raymond had a better argument, because Raymond had a better nervous system that day. Here is the truth about emotional regulation that most personal development content skips entirely because it is uncomfortable and it requires more than technique. Real regulation is not about suppressing what you feel. It is not about performing calm while rage or hurt or humiliation burns underneath. That is not regulation, that is repression, and repression always finds a way out, usually at the worst possible moment, usually with compounded force. Real regulation means feeling the full weight of what is happening inside you, acknowledging the anger, the hurt, the fear, and choosing, consciously and deliberately, not to be driven by it in this moment. It means saying to yourself, "This is real, this matters, and I am not going to let it make decisions for me right now." That distinction between feeling something and being controlled by it is the entire game. The goal is never to be someone who doesn't feel deeply. The goal is to be someone whose feelings inform their response without hijacking it. The people who master this, and it is a practice, not a destination, become genuinely undefeatable in conflict, not because nothing touches them, but because everything touches them and they remain standing anyway. In Chapter 6, we are going to take everything you have built so far, the understanding, the language, the silence, the regulation, and bring it into the most specific and difficult territory of all, the conversations with the people closest to you, the ones where the stakes are highest, the history is longest, and the wounds are deepest. Because winning with strangers is one thing. Winning without losing the people you love, that is an entirely different level of skill, and it is exactly where we are going next. Chapter 6. The hardest arguments you'll ever have. Why the people who know you best can hurt you most, and how to win without losing them. There is a particular kind of argument that does not happen with strangers. It does not happen with coworkers you barely know, or neighbors you wave at from the driveway, or the person at the customer service desk who got your order wrong. Those arguments are frustrating, yes, but they are contained. They have edges. When they end, you walk away, and the weight of them dissipates relatively quickly, because the relationship itself carries no deep history, no accumulated meaning, no part of your identity woven into its fabric. The argument that truly costs something, the one that can keep you awake at 2 a.m, the one that replays for days in a way you cannot silence, the one that doesn't just sting but leaves something behind, that argument happens with the people who matter most. Your partner, who knows the exact 3 sentences guaranteed to make you feel like you are 8 years old and completely powerless. Your parent, whose disapproval carries a weight that no adult achievement has ever fully neutralized. Your closest friend, who once knew every secret you had and can still weaponize the most vulnerable parts of your story without even meaning to. Your sibling, whose rivalry with you started before either of you could form a coherent sentence and has never entirely stopped. These are the hardest arguments you will ever have. Not because the issues are more complex, but because the person across from you is not just someone you disagree with. They are someone whose opinion of you lives inside you, and that changes everything about how you fight, how you receive, and how deeply you can be wounded. To understand why intimate conflict operates so differently from every other kind, you need to understand a concept that relationship psychologists have studied for decades, and that the research consistently identifies as one of the primary predictors of whether a relationship survives long-term difficulty. It is called emotional flooding, and it describes what happens when the cumulative weight of a relationship's history collides with the stress of a present conflict and overwhelms your capacity to function rationally. Dr. John Gottman, who spent over 40 years studying thousands of couples and relationships in his research laboratory at the University of Washington, found something remarkable. He could predict with startling accuracy which couples would eventually separate, not based on how much they argued, but based on what happened physiologically during their arguments. Couples whose heart rates exceeded a certain threshold during conflict, whose bodies entered full stress response during disagreements, consistently showed worse outcomes. Not because they were less committed, because they were too flooded to access the skills they actually possessed. The flooding happened specifically with the people they loved most. Strangers didn't trigger it the same way. Acquaintances didn't trigger it. But the person they had built a life with, the person whose words carried the most weight, the person whose rejection felt most threatening to their sense of self, that person could flood them in 30 seconds. You have experienced this. You know the feeling. The conversation with your partner starts over something genuinely minor, a schedule, a forgotten errand, an offhand comment, and within 5 minutes you are somehow talking about things from 3 years ago, and your voice is a register higher than normal, and something hot and irrational has taken over the conversation that neither of you entirely planned for. That is flooding. And the first step to winning arguments with the people you love is understanding that flooding, not bad intentions, not fundamental incompatibility, is usually the mechanism behind your worst conflicts. There is a specific dynamic in intimate conflict that operates like an invisible trap, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Gottman called them the 4 horsemen, 4 communication patterns that, when they appear consistently in close relationships, predict deterioration with extraordinary accuracy. They are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And the reason they are so destructive in intimate relationships specifically is because in close relationships, these patterns carry a meaning that they do not carry with strangers. When a stranger is contemptuous toward you, it stings, but it does not define you. When the person who knows you most deeply looks at you with contempt, with eye-rolling, with dismissiveness, with a particular expression that communicates, you are beneath serious consideration. It does not just hurt your feelings. It attacks your sense of being someone worthy of love, and from that place no rational conversation is possible, because you are no longer arguing about the issue. You are fighting for your fundamental worth as a human being. Understanding this changes your responsibility in intimate conflict. It means recognizing that when your partner becomes suddenly irrational, or your parent says something cruelly precise, or your closest friend goes ice-cold and unreachable, what is almost certainly happening beneath that behavior is not malice. It is someone whose sense of worth has been threatened and who does not yet have the tools to say that clearly. That recognition does not excuse the behavior, but it gives you a choice that judgment never could. There is a woman named Diane, a 43-year-old nurse from Nashville, who describes a pattern in her marriage that lasted nearly a decade before she understood what was actually happening. Every significant argument with her husband followed the same architecture. Something would trigger a disagreement. Her husband, who had grown up in a household where conflict meant someone always left, would begin to withdraw. His answers would get shorter. His eyes would go somewhere else. His body would physically turn away from her incrementally until he was almost completely closed off. And Diane, whose deepest fear from childhood was being abandoned and ignored, would respond to his withdrawal by escalating, pushing harder, speaking louder, saying sharper things designed to get a reaction, any reaction, because his silence felt more threatening than his anger ever could. He withdrew because conflict felt dangerous. She escalated because silence felt like abandonment. Neither of them was wrong about what they were feeling. Both of them were in completely different emotional crises simultaneously, and their individual responses to those crises were making the other person's crisis worse. This pattern, what therapists call the pursuer-withdrawer cycle, is one of the most common and most destructive dynamics in intimate conflict, and it has almost nothing to do with the topic being argued about. It is a collision of two people's deepest wounds, playing out over and over in the language of dishes and schedules and tone of voice. The moment Diane understood this, the moment she could see that her husband's withdrawal was not rejection, but self-protection, she stopped needing to escalate to feel safe. And the moment her husband understood that her escalation was not aggression, but desperate connection seeking, he stopped needing to disappear to survive. They did not fix their marriage with better arguments. They fixed it by finally seeing what the arguments were actually about. So what does winning look like in intimate conflict given everything you now understand about flooding, about the four horsemen, about the hidden wounds driving behavior on both sides? It looks almost nothing like what most people imagine when they think about winning. Winning in intimate conflict is not the moment the other person admits you were right. It is not the silence after you delivered the argument they had no answer for. It is not the satisfaction of having the last word with someone who spent years making you feel like your words didn't count. Winning in intimate conflict is the conversation that actually ends not with one person retreating in exhaustion, but with both people feeling like something real was addressed. It is the moment after the storm where the connection is still intact, maybe even stronger, because you both survived something difficult together and neither of you destroyed the other in the process. To get there, you need 3 specific practices that operate differently in intimate conflict than in any other context. The first is the repair attempt, a term Gottman uses to describe any gesture, word, or action that signals to the other person, I am still on your side, even in this moment. It might be as simple as reaching out and touching someone's hand during a tense conversation. It might be saying, "I love you, and I hate that we're fighting." It might be acknowledging in the middle of an argument that you said something hurtful and you want to take it back. Repair attempts, even clumsy ones, have enormous power in intimate conflict because they remind both people that the relationship is bigger than the disagreement. The second is the time out with a return commitment, which is fundamentally different from stonewalling. Stonewalling says, "I am done with this conversation and I am not coming back." A time out with a return commitment says, "I am too flooded to continue this productively right now, and I need 30 minutes. And then I am coming back because this matters too much not to finish." The distinction is everything. One abandons. The other protects it. Protects both the person who needs space and the person who fears that space means the end of something. The third is the most difficult and the most transformative vulnerability before accusation. Instead of opening with what the other person did wrong, opening with what it made you feel. Not as a strategy, as an act of genuine courage. Because in intimate relationships, vulnerability is not weakness. It is the only language that consistently reaches someone whose defenses are up. Accusations build walls. Vulnerability opens doors. Here is the truth, that this entire chapter has been building toward the one that will change how you enter every difficult conversation with someone you love. The goal in intimate conflict was never to win the argument. The goal was always to win the relationship, and those two objectives, pursued simultaneously with the right understanding, are not in conflict with each other. You can be honest and be kind. You can hold your position and hold your love for the person at the same time. You can fight for what you believe and fight for what you have built without sacrificing one for the other. That balance is not easy, but it is learnable. And the people who learn it, the ones who figure out how to stay both strong and soft in the same conversation, they don't just win arguments. They build something most people only ever hope for. In Chapter 7, we are leaving the personal and entering the professional, the boardroom, the workplace, the career-defining conversation with a boss or colleague or client where the stakes are high, the politics are real, and one wrong move can cost you more than just the argument. This is where the skills you have built become tools of genuine power. Chapter 7. Winning Without a Weapon. How to navigate power, politics, and high-stakes arguments in the professional world. There is a conversation happening right now in an office somewhere in America that will determine the trajectory of someone's career. Not because of a performance review, not because of a promotion announcement, or a quarterly earnings report, or a company-wide restructuring memo, because of a single conversation between two people in a room about something that matters, and the way that conversation lands will either open a door that changes everything or quietly close one that may never fully reopen. Maybe it is the project manager who finally needs to push back on a senior executive whose decisions are steering the team toward failure, and who has to do it without appearing insubordinate, without triggering political retaliation, and without losing the credibility they have spent 3 years carefully building. Maybe it is the employee who was passed over for the promotion they earned and now has to sit across from the manager who made that decision and have a conversation honest enough to matter, but controlled enough not to burn the relationship entirely. Maybe it is the entrepreneur in a client meeting where the deal is close and something the client just said is factually wrong, and agreeing with it would compromise the work, but contradicting it in the wrong way could end the conversation before it reaches a close. Professional conflict is its own universe, and the rules that govern it are entirely different from the rules of personal conflict, not because the psychology is different, but because the stakes have an additional layer that intimate conflict does not carry. In professional conflict, you are not just managing a relationship, you are managing a reputation, and reputation in a professional environment is the compound interest of every single interaction you have ever had built slowly over years and capable of being damaged significantly in a single, poorly navigated moment. To understand how to win in professional conflict, you first need to understand the invisible architecture that governs every workplace disagreement. Whether you are in a Fortune 500 corporation, a small family business, a creative agency, or a remote team spread across 3 time zones. That architecture is power, and in professional environments, power is almost never evenly distributed. There is almost always someone in the conversation with more institutional authority, more social capital, more tenure, or more proximity to the people who make final decisions, and that imbalance shapes everything. What can be said, how it can be said, who gets to say it without consequence, and who pays a price for saying the same thing in the same way. Most people respond to this imbalance in one of 2 ways, both of which are losing strategies. The first response is silence. They see the power differential, they feel the risk of speaking up, and they choose to say nothing. The idea goes unvoiced. The problem continues. The wrong decision gets made because the person who could see the problem most clearly decided the personal cost of saying so was too high. And the quiet resentment that builds from swallowing that truth, from watching something fail that you could have prevented, is one of the most corrosive forces in any professional life. The second response is recklessness. Frustration finally overcomes caution. The truth comes out, but without strategy, without framing, without any of the relational architecture that makes uncomfortable truth receivable. The point lands like an accusation rather than an insight. Defenses go up. Politics activate. And the person who was actually right about the problem becomes the problem in everyone's mind, the difficult one, the negative one, the one who doesn't understand how things work around here. There is a third response, and it is the one that genuinely works. It is called strategic framing, and it is the practice of packaging your truth inside a structure that makes it not just receivable, but welcome. Here is the fundamental principle in professional environments. People with authority rarely reject good ideas because the ideas are bad. They reject good ideas because of how those ideas make them feel, because the idea was presented in a way that implied they had missed something, because the person presenting it seemed to be positioning themselves as smarter, more capable, or more valuable than the person being addressed, because the timing was wrong, or the audience was wrong, or the implicit message underneath the explicit message was one that threatened rather than invited. Strategic framing neutralizes all of that. It means that before you deliver your point, you have already answered the unspoken question in the other person's mind, which in professional contexts almost always sounds some version of this: is this person trying to help the outcome, or are they trying to make me look bad? The moment they believe you are genuinely invested in the outcome, not just the victory, their defenses drop, and your idea has a real chance of being heard. The language of strategic framing sounds like this: I want to think through something with you because I think there might be an opportunity we haven't fully explored yet. Not, I think we're making a mistake. Not, I disagree with the direction we're going. Those phrases, however accurate, trigger ego defense in professional settings with remarkable speed. But I want to think through something with you. That phrase does something entirely different. It positions you as a collaborator, not a critic. It invites rather than challenges, and it makes the person across from you feel like a partner in discovery rather than a target of correction. Same point, completely different architecture, dramatically different outcome. There is a man named Jordan who works as a senior analyst at a mid-sized financial services firm in New York. 2 years into his role, he found himself in a situation that will feel familiar to anyone who has spent time in a corporate environment. His director, someone with significant influence over his career trajectory, was pushing a client recommendation that Jordan was increasingly certain was wrong. Not slightly wrong, materially, demonstrably wrong in a way that was going to cost the client real money and ultimately reflect badly on the entire team when the numbers came in. Jordan had three options as he saw them at the time. He could say nothing and let it happen. He could send an email documenting his objection, which would protect him technically, but damage the relationship politically. Or he could have the conversation directly. He chose the conversation, but he chose it carefully. He did not walk into his director's office with data designed to prove his director wrong. He walked in with a question. "I've been running some scenarios on the Henderson recommendation, and a few numbers are giving me pause. Would you have 15 minutes to look at them with me? I want to make sure I'm not missing something before we finalize." Notice what that framing does. It presents Jordan as uncertain rather than certain, which is disarming. It positions the director as the authority being consulted rather than the person being corrected, which protects the power dynamic. And it creates a collaborative context where looking at the numbers together makes both of them right if the conclusion changes rather than one of them right and one of them wrong. The director looked at the numbers. The recommendation was changed. The client relationship was preserved, and Jordan's director, without ever feeling challenged, became one of his strongest internal advocates. Jordan did not win by being smarter. He won by being strategically generous with the other person's ego, and in professional environments, that generosity is not weakness. It is one of the most sophisticated forms of intelligence available. There is a specific category of professional conflict that deserves its own attention because it operates by rules that most people never figure out until they have already paid a significant price for not knowing them. It is the conflict with someone who has more power than you and less interest in being fair. The difficult boss, the senior colleague who takes credit, the client who changes the terms after the agreement, the executive who dismisses your contributions publicly and then presents them privately as their own. Most people, when they encounter this kind of conflict, make one of two mistakes. They either absorb the injustice, silently telling themselves it is not worth the fight, that the power differential makes it unwinnable, that the political cost is too high, or they respond with open confrontation that satisfies something emotionally but strategically hands the more powerful person every advantage. The approach that actually works in these situations requires understanding one thing about power in professional environments that most people miss entirely. Institutional power is real, but it is not infinite, and the person wielding it is almost always more aware of its limits than they appear. The most effective response to professional injustice is not confrontation and not silence. It is the calm, documented, relentlessly professional articulation of reality delivered without heat, without accusation, and with enough specificity that the other person understands clearly that you see exactly what is happening and you are not afraid of it. This approach works because it removes the thing that people who misuse power depend on most: your emotional reaction. Your anger gives them justification. Your silence gives them permission. Your calm, clear, documented professionalism gives them neither. And it creates a record of reality that protects you in ways that heated confrontation never could. Here is the principle that governs every professional conflict you will ever navigate from this point forward, and it is worth more than any tactic or technique in this chapter. Your reputation is always in the room even when you are not. Every interaction either adds to it or subtracts from it. And the person who consistently handles conflict with intelligence, composure, and genuine investment in outcome, that person builds a kind of professional credibility that no single argument, won or lost, can manufacture on its own. You are not just winning a conversation when you handle professional conflict well. You are building the character of someone people trust with the hard things, and that trust compounded over time, in room after room, conversation after conversation, becomes the most durable advantage any career can have. In Chapter 8, we are going to move into territory that is even more nuanced, The art of disagreeing with someone without making them your enemy. How to hold a position under sustained pressure without becoming rigid. How to change your mind without losing your credibility. And how to make someone respect you more for the way you handled the conflict than they ever would have for winning it cleanly. The difference between opponents and allies is almost always made in the arguments that happen between them. And you are about to learn exactly how to make that difference work in your favor. Chapter 8. The Art of Standing Firm Without Building Walls. How to hold your ground, change your mind with grace, and turn opponents into allies. There is a quality that the most respected people in any room consistently possess, and it is not what most people assume it is. It is not the ability to never be wrong. Nobody with real experience and genuine credibility believes that standard is achievable, and anyone still performing it in their 40s has already quietly lost the respect of the people paying closest attention. It is not the ability to win every argument. The person who wins every argument in a room eventually becomes the person nobody wants to bring real problems to, because real problems require honest dialogue, and honest dialogue requires the kind of safety that compulsive winning destroys. It is not even the ability to stay calm under pressure, though that matters enormously, and you have already built that skill across the chapters that came before this one. The quality that genuinely distinguishes the most respected people in any room, in boardrooms, in marriages, in friendships, in any environment where trust is the currency that determines outcomes, is something rarer and more difficult than any of those things. It is the ability to hold a position with complete conviction while simultaneously remaining genuinely open to being wrong, to stand firm without becoming rigid, to change your mind without losing your footing, to disagree fully and fight cleanly, and then, when the conversation is over, make the person who disagreed with you feel like the exchange made both of you better rather than one of you diminished. That ability, that precise, rare, extraordinarily powerful combination, is not a personality trait. It is a learnable skill, and it begins with understanding the difference between a position and an identity. Most people in conflict do not argue about ideas. They argue about themselves. This sounds strange until you examine it closely, and then it becomes almost impossible not to see it everywhere. When someone defends a position with a level of intensity that seems disproportionate to the actual stakes of the issue, what is almost always happening underneath is that the position has become fused with their sense of self. Being wrong about the idea would mean being wrong as a person. Changing their mind would feel like a kind of self-betrayal, an admission not just of an intellectual error, but of something more fundamental about their competence, their judgment, their worth. This fusion between what a person believes and who a person is one of the most destructive forces in human conflict. It is what turns a disagreement about strategy into a fight for survival. It is what makes otherwise intelligent people defend positions they privately know are weakening, long past the point where the evidence has made the intelligent move obvious. It is what creates the particular kind of stubbornness that everyone recognizes from the outside, and almost nobody can see in themselves. The antidote is a practice that psychologists call intellectual humility, and it requires making one fundamental internal distinction that changes everything. Your ideas are things you hold, not things you are. Your position in a conversation is a current best understanding based on available information, not a permanent declaration of your character. When new information arrives, updating your position is not weakness. It is the most direct evidence of a mind that is actually working. The people who understand this distinction are formidable in conflict, precisely because they cannot be threatened the way other people can. There is nothing to protect at the level of identity, so the entire energy that other people spend defending themselves becomes available for something far more useful, actually figuring out what is true. But intellectual humility without the ability to hold firm when you are right is not a virtue. It is a liability. And this is where most people fall off in one direction or the other. Some people are so committed to being open-minded that they capitulate the moment they sense social pressure, not because new information arrived, but because the discomfort of being disagreed with became more than they wanted to manage. This is not intellectual humility. This is conflict avoidance wearing the mask of open-mindedness, and it produces a particular kind of professional and personal invisibility where people learn quickly that your positions are negotiable under pressure, and they stop taking them seriously because the pressure of disagreement is always available. Other people are so committed to holding their ground that they cannot distinguish between principled firmness and simple ego protection. They hold positions past the point of evidence. They interpret every challenge as an attack. They confuse stubbornness with strength and call their rigidity integrity, not realizing that the people around them have stopped bringing their real thinking to the conversation because the outcome is always the same regardless of the quality of the argument. The space between these two failure modes, the space where genuine strength lives, requires one specific internal question that you learn to ask yourself in real time during any difficult conversation. The question is this: am I holding this position because the evidence still supports it, or because letting go of it would feel like losing? That question, asked honestly and answered honestly, is the most reliable compass you will ever have in conflict, because it separates your reasoning from your ego in the precise moment when they are most likely to be confused with each other. There is a technique used by some of the most effective negotiators, leaders, and communicators in the world for changing their position in a conversation without losing the credibility that position represented, and it is elegant in its simplicity. It is called the visible pivot, and it works because it transforms the act of changing your mind from something that looks like retreat into something that looks like exactly what it actually is: the behavior of a person who is genuinely engaged with the truth. It sounds like this: you just gave me something I hadn't considered, and I want to think about that seriously, because if you're right about that part, it changes how I've been looking at the whole picture. Read that carefully. Notice what it does and does not do. It does not abandon the previous position defensively or apologetically, as if the person had to be dragged to the update. It does not perform a sudden dramatic conversion that feels theatrical and therefore untrustworthy. It acknowledges the specific new information that warranted the update, which signals that the change was driven by thinking, not by pressure. And it frames the update as engagement rather than defeat, because genuine intellectual engagement with someone's point is one of the most powerful forms of respect you can offer them in a conflict. When you pivot visibly and specifically like this, something remarkable happens to the other person's posture in the conversation. They stop pushing, not because they got what they wanted, but because they got something better. They got evidence that you are actually listening, and that evidence, more than any concession, is what turns opponents into allies. Consider the story of two business partners, Marcus and Stephen, who built a marketing agency together in Atlanta over 7 years, and who nearly destroyed both the business and the friendship in a single 6-month period of sustained conflict over the company's strategic direction. Marcus believed the agency needed to specialize to narrow its service offering, fire the clients who weren't the right fit, and go deep in one vertical, rather than trying to serve everyone adequately. Stephen believed the opposite, that specialization was a risk they couldn't afford. That breadth was their competitive advantage, and that Marcus was mistaking his personal preference for genuine strategy. Both of them were partly right. Both of them spent 6 months being entirely unable to hear the part the other one had correct, because both of them had fused their strategic position with their identity as the smarter partner, the one with better business instincts, the one the other should have been listening to all along. The breakthrough came not from a better argument, but from a single question that Stephen asked in what he described as a moment of genuine exhaustion with the whole fight. He looked at Marcus and said, "What would have to be true for your position to be wrong?" Not as an attack, as a real question, because Stephen had started asking it of himself first, and when he did, he found 3 things in Marcus's argument that he had been refusing to seriously consider, because considering them would have meant updating his position. Once he named those 3 things out loud, Marcus, who had been braced for another round of the same fight, went quiet. Then he asked the same question back, and in the answers that followed, both of them found the actual strategy, a version that neither of them had arrived at alone, that was better than either of their original positions and that the company is still operating on today. They did not find it by one of them winning. They found it by both of them becoming genuinely more interested in the truth than in being right about it. Here's the principle that this entire chapter has been constructed around, and it is one of the most counterintuitive truths about conflict that you will encounter in this audiobook. The person who is willing to change their mind is more persuasive, not less. The person who can hold their ground without contempt is more trusted, not less. And the person who ends a conflict with the other person feeling genuinely respected, even in disagreement, even in loss, has not just won an argument. They have built something that no single argument could ever manufacture on its own. They have built influence, the real kind, the kind that accumulates in rooms before you enter them, in the way people talk about you, in the way they frame your input before you have even given it, in the way they come to you with the hard problems, because they know you will handle both the truth and the relationship with equal care. In Chapter 9, we are going to talk about something that most people never plan for, but everyone eventually faces the conflict with someone who is not arguing in good faith. The manipulator, the gaslighter, the person who uses the language of reasonable conversation while operating with entirely unreasonable intent. Because everything you have learned so far assumes a level of honesty that not every opponent will bring to the table. And you need to be Chapter 9, when the other person isn't playing fair. How to recognize manipulation, disarm gaslighting, and win against someone who fights without rules. Everything you have learned in this audiobook has been built on a foundational assumption, one so reasonable, so basic, that most people never think to question it until the moment it gets violated in a way that leaves them completely disoriented. The assumption is this: the person across from you, however frustrated or defensive or emotionally activated they might be, is engaging with you honestly. They may be wrong, they may be reactive, they may be carrying wounds that are distorting their perception of the present moment, but at the core of the exchange, they are trying to communicate something real, and the tools you have built across these chapters can reach that real thing, address it, and move both of you towards something better. Most of the time, that assumption holds. Most conflicts, even the brutal ones, even the ones that leave you shaking, are between 2 people who are both genuinely trying to be understood, however clumsily, however destructively they are going about it. But not always. There is a category of conflict that operates by an entirely different set of rules, where the other person is not trying to be understood, is not genuinely invested in resolution, and is not engaging with you in good faith at all, where the conversation itself is not the arena, it is the weapon, where the goal is not to reach agreement, but to destabilize you, control you, exhaust you, or make you doubt the very perceptions and instincts that would otherwise allow you to protect yourself. This chapter is about those conversations, and the people who initiate them, because no amount of emotional intelligence, strategic framing, or empathetic listening will win a conflict against someone who is using the language of reasonable conversation to pursue entirely unreasonable ends, unless you first recognize exactly what is happening. The first thing you need to understand about bad faith conflict is that it almost never announces itself as what it is. Nobody sits across from you and says, "I'm going to manipulate this conversation to make you feel crazy, undermine your confidence, and ensure that regardless of what is true, you walk away believing you were wrong." The manipulation is almost always delivered in the packaging of legitimate conversation, concern, confusion, hurt feelings, reasonable questions, appeals to fairness. This is what makes it so disorienting, because your conflict instincts, the ones this audiobook has been training and sharpening, are calibrated for honest engagement. When you try to apply empathy to someone who is weaponizing your empathy, you do not resolve the conflict. You deepen your own confusion. When you try to address the underlying need of someone whose underlying need is control, you do not reach them. You hand them more leverage. The single most important skill in bad faith conflict is recognition, identifying what you are actually dealing with before you decide how to respond. And recognition requires knowing the specific patterns that bad faith conflict consistently produces, because they are identifiable once you know what to look for. The most well-known and most psychologically damaging form of bad faith conflict is gaslighting, a term that has entered mainstream conversation in recent years, but whose mechanics are still widely misunderstood in ways that leave people vulnerable to it. Gaslighting is not simply lying. Lying is the presentation of false information as true. But gaslighting is something more targeted and more insidious. It is the systematic undermining of another person's trust in their own perceptions, memory, and judgment. Its goal is not to win an argument about what happened. Its goal is to make you uncertain enough about what happened that you stop trusting your own account of reality. It sounds like this: "That never happened. You're imagining things." Or, "You're too sensitive. Nobody else has a problem with the way I talk." Or, "I never said that. You always twist my words." Or the particularly devastating version, "I'm genuinely worried about you. The way you've been misremembering things lately concerns me." Notice the architecture. Each of these statements does not engage with the content of what you have said. They engage with your capacity to accurately perceive and report reality. They are not arguments about the facts. They are arguments about your reliability as a witness to your own experience. The reason gaslighting is so effective is because it exploits something deeply human: our fundamental need to have our perceptions confirmed by the people we are in relationship with. When someone we trust consistently tells us that what we experienced is not what we experienced, most people do not immediately conclude that the other person is lying. They conclude, quietly and with increasing certainty, that something might be wrong. There is a woman named Angela from Phoenix who spent 4 years in a professional relationship with a business partner who was masterful at this specific pattern. Every time Angela raised a concern about decisions being made without her input, her partner would respond not by addressing the concern, but by expressing worry about Angela's state of mind. "You seem really stressed lately. Are you okay? Because this doesn't sound like you." Every time Angela brought documentation of an agreement that had been violated, her partner would express confusion, so genuine seeming that Angela would leave the conversation, wondering whether she had misread the original agreement entirely. It took Angela 2 years to understand what was happening, and it only clicked when she started writing things down, not for legal purposes initially, just for her own sanity. A contemporaneous record of what was said, what was agreed, what was promised. And when she looked at that record over several months, the pattern became undeniable. The confusion was not genuine. The concern was not real. The conversation was being used, repeatedly and deliberately, to make her doubt herself enough to stop pushing back. The journal did not just give Angela evidence. It gave her something more fundamental than that. It gave her back her own reality. This is the first and most essential tool against gaslighting and bad faith conflict: external documentation of internal reality. Write down what was said. Write down what was agreed. Write down the date, the context, the specific words as closely as you can recall them, not obsessively, not as an act of paranoia, but as a simple, consistent practice of honoring your own perceptions by treating them as worth recording. Because the gaslighter's primary weapon is your doubt, and documentation is doubt's most direct antidote. When you have a record when you can look back and see, in your own words written at the time, what actually happened, the manufactured confusion loses its grip. You are no longer relying on memory against memory. You have something concrete, and that concreteness rebuilds the internal ground that bad faith conflict is specifically designed to erode beneath you. The second pattern of bad faith conflict is Darvo, a term coined by psychologist Dr. Jennifer Freyd that describes a manipulation sequence so common and so effective that once you learn to recognize it, you will see it operating in conflicts you thought you understood and didn't. Darvo stands for deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. It works like this. You raise a concern or a grievance. The other person denies it, then attacks your credibility or character for raising it, and then repositions themselves as the real victim of the exchange, leaving you in the position of having to defend yourself against a charge you never made, about a harm you never intended. In a conversation you entered, as the person with a legitimate grievance. It is a breathtakingly effective maneuver, because it completely inverts the moral architecture of the exchange in under 30 seconds. You came in with a real concern. You leave having been accused of causing harm. And somewhere in the disorienting middle of that reversal, your original point gets buried under the wreckage of a conflict you never intended to start. The counter to Darvo is a skill called narrative anchoring, and it requires one specific discipline that is harder than it sounds under pressure. You do not follow the reversal. You name it, briefly and without accusation, and you return to your original point. It sounds like this. I hear that you're upset, and I want to address that, but I need us to finish talking about what I originally raised, because that hasn't been addressed yet. You do not get drawn into defending yourself against the new accusation. You do not abandon your original concern to manage their performed distress. You hold the thread. You return to it. You stay on your point with a patience and a steadiness that makes the reversal visible without requiring you to name it as manipulation. There is a third pattern worth naming specifically because it operates in almost every bad faith conflict at some point, and most people respond to it in exactly the wrong way. It is escalation, as control, the deliberate raising of emotional temperature, volume, or stakes designed not to express genuine feeling, but to overwhelm your capacity to think clearly and hold your position. The person who suddenly becomes dramatically more upset the moment you make a point they cannot answer. The person who introduces an entirely new accusation every time the current one fails to land. The person whose emotional state seems to intensify in precise proportion to how close you are getting to a truth they do not want acknowledged. The response that works here is not matching their escalation or retreating from it. It is something more disorienting to them than either of those options. It is stillness, complete, unperturbed, unhurried stillness. The calm that communicates your performance is not changing my assessment of what is true, because escalation as control depends entirely on your reaction. It is a fire that needs oxygen. Your stillness removes the oxygen, and a performance with no audience has nowhere to go. Here is what this chapter ultimately comes down to, and it is perhaps the most important protection you will carry from this entire audiobook. You cannot out-empathize someone who is using your empathy against you. You cannot out-reason someone whose goal was never reason, and you cannot resolve a conflict with someone who needs the conflict to continue in order to maintain the control they are not willing to earn any other way. Recognition is your protection. Documentation is your anchor. Stillness is your defense. And knowing when a conversation is no longer a conversation, when it has become something else entirely, is the most sophisticated judgment this work will ever ask of you. In the final chapter, we bring everything together. Every skill, every principle, every hard-won understanding from every chapter that came before, it all converges in the place where this journey has been heading from the very first word. The transformation is not just in how you argue, it is in who you become when the pressure is on. And that person, calm, clear, unshakable. Chapter 10. The person you become. When you stop fighting to win and start living with the power of someone who never has to prove a thing, think back to the person who started this audiobook with you. Not the person you are right now, the one who has traveled through 9 chapters of some of the most honest, most precise, most psychologically grounded thinking about human conflict that most people will never encounter in a lifetime of difficult conversations. Think about the person who pressed play at the beginning, the one who showed up with something unresolved, something they were tired of losing, something they wanted badly enough to give 2 hours of their life to understanding. Maybe they were thinking about a specific person, someone whose voice alone is enough to make their chest tighten. Maybe they were thinking about a pattern, the same argument cycling endlessly with the same outcome, the same exhaustion, the same distance afterward that never quite closes all the way. Maybe they were not thinking about anyone specific at all, just carrying the quiet weight of feeling like their words never land the way they deserve to, like the people who should listen most consistently, listen least, like there is a version of themselves in conversation that they have never quite been able to access when the moment actually demands it. That person brought something real to this journey. And what you have built across these chapters, chapter by chapter, layer by layer, is not a collection of techniques to be deployed strategically when conflict arises. It is something far more fundamental than that. What you have built is a different relationship with conflict itself. And that shift from conflict is something that happens to you, but conflict is something you move through with intention, and clarity changes not just how you argue. It changes who you are in every room you enter for the rest of your life. There is a distinction that this final chapter exists to draw cleanly, permanently, in a way that stays with you long after the last word of this audiobook fades. It is the distinction between winning arguments and becoming someone who rarely needs to. Because here's the truth that sits at the very heart of everything you have learned. The people who are genuinely most powerful in conflict are not the ones who deploy their skills most frequently. They are the ones whose presence alone restructures a room before a difficult word is spoken, whose reputation for fairness, for precision, for genuine emotional intelligence is so established that people bring their best thinking to conversations with them because they know the exchange will be honest and the outcome will be real and their dignity will be intact when it is over. These people do not win every argument. They win something more durable. They win the long-term trust of the people around them. They win the kind of influence that does not need to announce itself. They win the internal freedom that comes from knowing with complete certainty that you can handle whatever conversation walks through the door, because you have handled the hardest ones, and you know what you are made of. That is the destination this audiobook has been pointing toward from the very first word of the hook. Not a sharper weapon, a stronger person. Let's revisit briefly the architecture of what you have built, because seeing it whole, seeing all the layers together in one clear view, is itself a kind of transformation. You began by understanding that volume was never power, that the loudest voice in the room is almost always the most threatened one, and that the person who stays calm while others escalate holds an advantage that no amount of volume can overcome. You learn to look underneath the surface of conflict to ask not what the argument is about, but what the person is feeling beneath the argument. What need is going unmet? What wound is getting activated? And you discovered that addressing the real conversation, the one beneath the stated one, ends in minutes, What surface level arguing extends for years? You learn that your words are not just communication, they are neurological architecture, that but erases while and builds, that absolute language hands the other person an escape hatch from your most legitimate point, that I statements disarm where you statements attack, that the language you choose either opens the other person's mind or closes it before your most important sentence has finished landing. You discover the profound power of silence, that the deliberate pause, the strategic space, the stillness held with full presence and zero urgency communicates something that no sentence can manufacture, that the person most comfortable with quiet, you built the skill of emotional regulation from the inside out, not as performance, not as suppression, but as the real-time practice of feeling everything fully and choosing, deliberately and consciously, not to be driven by it. You learn that the space between stimulus and response is not just a poetic idea, it is a trainable capacity, and you have begun training it. You navigated the hardest terrain of all the intimate conflicts, where history and love and old wounds make everything louder and more personal than it needs to be. You found the vocabulary for those conversations, repair attempts, vulnerable openings, the pursuit-withdrawal cycle seen clearly enough to step out of it instead of running it on autopilot for another decade. You learned how to move through professional conflict with strategic intelligence, how to deliver uncomfortable truth inside a frame that keeps it receivable, how to protect your reputation while still speaking honestly, how to make the person with more power feel like a partner in discovery rather than a target of correction. You learned how to hold your ground without building walls, how to stay firm when firmness is warranted, and update when updating is honest, and how to make both of those moves in ways that increase your credibility rather than eroding it. And you learn to recognize and disarm the conversations that were never honest to begin with. The gaslighting, the darvo, the escalation designed not to communicate but to control. You learn that recognition is protection, documentation is your anchor, and stillness removes the oxygen from every performance that depends on your reaction to continue. There is a man whose story belongs at the end of this audiobook more than any other. His name is not famous. He did not write a best-selling book or build a publicly recognized career on the back of his communication skills. He is a high school history teacher from Cincinnati named Warren, who has been teaching for 26 years, and who, by his own account, spent the first 12 of those years losing the same argument with his students over and over again. Not the academic arguments. Those he won easily, because he had the authority and the knowledge and the grade book. The other arguments, the ones where a 17-year-old sits in the back of the room with their arms crossed and their jaws set, and a look that says nothing you say matters to me, and you cannot make it matter, and we both know it. Warren used to respond to that look with escalation, with the authority of his position, with the weight of the institution behind him, with the implicit threat of consequences. And it worked in the narrowest sense. Students complied. They sat down. They turned in the assignment. But they never changed. And Warren, quietly over 12 years, started to understand that compliance was not what he was actually after. The shift came when he stopped trying to win the argument about behavior and started asking, genuinely and without agenda, about what was happening underneath it. When he sat next to the kid with crossed arms instead of standing over him. When he said, quietly enough that only the student could hear, "I'm not trying to embarrass you. I just want to understand what's going on." He describes the first time a student answered that question honestly as one of the most significant moments of his professional life, because what came out was not defiance. What came out was a 15-year-old carrying more weight than any adult in that building had bothered to notice, and who had been performing the only kind of strength available to him, which was refusal. Warren did not win that conversation with a technique. He won it by becoming, genuinely and over years of practice, Someone whose presence made honesty feel safe, and from that safety, something real could finally happen. 26 years in, Warren is the teacher students come back to visit after graduation, the one they call when their own lives get complicated. Not because he was the strictest, not because he ran the most structured classroom, because he was the one who made them feel like what they said mattered, even when what they said was wrong, even when what they needed was not agreement, but a steady, honest, caring presence that told them the truth without making them feel small for needing to hear it. That is the full expression of everything this audiobook has been building toward. Here's the last thing this audiobook will ask of you, and it is not a technique or a framework or a language pattern to memorize and deploy. It is a decision. The decision to stop measuring your success in conflict by whether you walked away with the last word, and to start measuring it by whether you walked away with your integrity intact, the relationship preserved or strengthened, and the truth of the situation more visible to everyone in the room than it was before you spoke. That standard is harder than winning. It asks more of you than being right. It requires the kind of patience that does not come naturally to most people, and the kind of courage that is not loud enough to be mistaken for aggression. But it produces something that winning never can. It produces a life where the people closest to you trust you with the hard things, where the rooms you enter get quieter in a good way, the way rooms get quiet when someone arrives whose presence carries genuine weight, where you no longer spend the drive home rehearsing what you should have said, because what you said was already what needed to be said, delivered the way it needed to be delivered, to a person who felt the difference between being handled and being honored. You came to this audiobook because something in your life needed to change, something in how you communicate, how you are heard, how you show up when the pressure is highest and the stakes feel most real. That change is not ahead of you anymore. It has already begun. The person who wins without raising their voice does not find that power somewhere outside themselves. They build it conversation by conversation, chapter by chapter, choice by choice, until one day they realize the arguments that used to consume them have simply stopped having the same power over them. Not because the world got easier, because they got stronger.